So, how does Firouzja stand so far in this year's candidates after 4 rounds? Well, not as well as he'd hoped. I'm going to go over today's game, which was against Nepomniachtchi when Firouzja had the black pieces. I'm going to go fairly quickly. It won't be a very detailed examination. We're going to look at it briefly, and then I'm going to tell you where I think Firouzja stands. I'm going to give you reasons to worry, but also some reasons to be optimistic about his chances. Let's jump right in. Nepomniachtchi has white, Firouzja has black, and it's a Sicilian Najdorf. F3, E5, knight to B3, bishop E6, obviously wants to control the D5 square, bishop E3. This is all very standard. In fact, they're into the 20th move before an original move is played here. G4, obviously Nepomniachtchi wants to gain space on the king side, kick that knight, and remove its control over the D5 square. B5, G5, and here instead of moving the knight, he counteracts with B4. This is actually an old line. This is still all theory for quite a while. The knight retreats to E2. Black's knight goes to E8. F4, A5, F5, bishop to C4, king to B1, A4, knight B to C1. So we're seeing what's going on here. White is attacking on the king side, black is attacking on the queen side, and it's a very sharp position, but they're still in theory. Firouzja breaks with D5, the standard break that Najdorf players want to make, and F6, pawn takes, and here, pawn takes pawn is actually a novelty, or you might call it a pseudo-novelty, because they actually move order back into a known position. The move knight to G3 is actually the move that had been played here before. Nepomniachtchi takes on F6, knight df6, knight, then goes to G3, then bishop F1, rook HF1. And this position had also been reached before, strange as it is to believe. A3, B3. So we see that Nepomniachtchi has these weak dark squares, but the files are clogged. That's one of the challenges that Firouzja has in the attack here. Whereas Nepomniachtchi has this G file that he can play on. King to H8 to move off of that file. ED5. Now here is Firouzja's big mistake. The correct move here is queen to C7. He keeps control over D6, but allows this bishop to continue to defend the B4 pawn. This is not one of those pawns that black can just sacrifice to open lines. He actually needs to protect that pawn. It's a strong pawn, and with the pawn on B3, he wouldn't get any activity down the B file anyway. He needs to protect that pawn, but instead he plays the move knight to D6, and the knight blocks the bishop's defense of the pawn, and Nepomniachtchi goes ahead and grabs it. And from this point forward, he never relinquishes his advantage. Rook to C8, bishop to B6 hits the queen. The queen goes back to E1, rook to B8, bishop to A5, knight to C4, trying to take advantage of the pin down the B file. D6, bishop to D8, of course, challenging this bishop at A5. The bishop goes to C3, putting a lot of pressure on this diagonal. You'll see that that dark square diagonal is very sensitive, leading towards the king. Queen to E6, knight to D3, the knight, the bishop, and the queen all hitting the pawn. Knight to D5, and now knight to F4, taking advantage of the fact that the pawn is pinned down the diagonal. Knight F4, rook F4, again, the pawn cannot take because of the pin. F6 removes the pin, but now queen to E2. So now there's a pin up the E file against the queen. So there's still a pin, it's just in a completely different direction. The knight jumps into B2, the rook has to move. Rook E8, rook to H4, and after F5, Nepomniachtchi plays the decisive continuation. Rook takes H7 check, king H7, queen to H5 check. Firouzja plays the king to G8. If he had interposed with the queen, he just takes on E8, and the pressure on F5 and E5, the game is over. I think it's like plus 17 on the computers here, so that would have been the end of it. But king to G8 actually leads to a forced mate. Knight F5. The threat is queen to G4 check, and then queen to G7 check mate. Bishop to F6 to control the G7 square, but then rook to G1 check. And here, Firouzja resigned, the continuation would have been king to f8, queen to h6 check, king to f7, rook to g7 check. And the rook cannot be captured by the bishop because queen g7 would be mate. So the king would have to move, then queen to h8, boom, boom. And that would be how the game would have ended. So after the end of 4 rounds in a 14-round tournament, Alireza has 1.5 points. He's in last place, tied with Ding Liren and Rajabov. And Nepomniachtchi, his opponent in this game, is at the top with 3 points out of 4. He's having a very good tournament, which a lot of people are disappointed in because he didn't do that well when he won it last year. He didn't do very well against Magnus and the World Championship. So, what are some reasons for real concern about Alireza? Well, one, he's only had an edge in one of the 4 games he's played, and that game was drawn. So he wasn't able to quite win it. It wasn't a huge advantage, but he had an advantage. The other 3 games, he hasn't had an advantage at all. Either he's been fighting back to get a draw, as he did in 2 of the games, or in this game, obviously, he lost. The second reason to be concerned is his general play just has not looked its best. He seemed a little off. He seems to not be doing as well. And in this game, for example, he played a really long line that went 20 moves deep. And he's usually a little bit better when he plays something original very early in the opening and gets an original position, not these long, complicated lines like we saw in this game. And of course, the last reason to be concerned is that he is tied for last place. But there are reasons to be hopeful as well. There are reasons for optimism for Firouzja. And the first is it's still very early in the event. It's 4 rounds down, 10 rounds to go. He's got 1.5 out of the 4, but he's only 1.5 games out of first place. So with 10 rounds to go, there's still plenty of time to catch up. The second reason for optimism is in these first 4 games, he had black in 3 of them. And the one game he had with white, he was pressing the advantage. So that means in the remaining games, in the remaining 10 games, he will have white in 6 and black in 4. So he's going to have a lot of games with the white pieces moving forward, and that's good news for him. And finally, his biggest threat in this tournament, the highest rated player, Firouzja was the second highest rated player. The highest rated player, Ding Liren, the only other player other than Magnus rated over 2,800, is having an even worse tournament. He has the same score that Firouzja has, 1.5 out of 4, but unlike Firouzja, Ding Liren has had white in 3 of his 4 games. And so he's really not doing well at all. So the greatest challenge Firouzja was going to face is struggling just like Firouzja is. In Firouzja's last tournament, he started not very well and finished strong. Not enough to contend for first place, but he finished strong. So, and that's my hope here. There are some reasons for optimism, even though it hasn't started as well as we fans of his would hope. So we'll see what happens in the remaining tournament. Join us again soon at Chess Dog. See you then. Bye.